I'm Carla McLaren, and I have written a book called The Language of Emotions, What Your Feelings Are Trying to Tell You. And I wanted to, when they suggested the subtitle to me, I wanted to either underline trying, as in what your feelings are trying to tell you, or I wanted to say what your feelings are trying to tell you, dummy. But they wouldn't let me do it. What I'm talking about in the book is that feelings, emotions, are parts of our cognition, and they're trying very hard to tell us what's going on in the social world or telling us what's going on inside ourselves. But we tend not to know that. We tend not to have been taught that. So this book is sort of an entree into emotional intelligence or emotional understanding.
Well, in your book, you start off by saying, I'm an empath. So can you talk about what that means?
For much of my early career, thought that I was a psychic because I could pick up things about people that didn't seem to be what other people saw. I would notice things about people at a very subtle level and be able to talk about them as if I had known them for a long time. And because I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, what I could do was seen as somehow paranormal. So I worked for a long time as a psychic healer without understanding that what I was doing was primarily and almost exclusively reading emotions and nuance and undercurrent and what wasn't said and that sort of thing. So now I understand that I am an empath, which we all are. We all have to be in order to function, because language is not all that we read when we're listening to people. But that because it was so unusually developed in me, it became sort of the central organizing factor of my life. And so I took the empathy at first, excuse me, I took the empathy at first to read other people. And then I also utilized it because empathy helps you do place taking, where you can get yourself into the place of another person. But I find you can also do it with things, with ideas, with concepts. So for instance, when I was learning math, I would place take and become a number and then understand how to do math by saying, okay, I become a 7 at this point. And then if I'm raised to the second power, then I become 49. I found that I could learn things more easily by place taking. And it's how I learn most of the things. I am dyslexic, so probably a lot of that empathy is a way for me to work around the difficulties that I have had with language. But I find it works beautifully, and it can make you look either unusually intelligent or unusually dense to pick things up emotionally and say, well, wait a minute. That wasn't what I heard. I know what he said, but what I saw was this. And sometimes it would make me look like I was just amazingly aware of my surroundings. And yet at other times, people would say, that didn't happen. What he said was this. And there was nothing else being said. And so I just have to kind of sit in the background and go, okay. So it's been an unusual thing to be me, and to have these, my mom called them plus disabilities, to be able to see more in a situation than other people do. And sometimes that's great, but sometimes it gives you too much information.
And how do you define empath? If you gave a broader kind of definition of an empath?
I would say an empath is someone who is aware that they're reading emotions and undercurrent and nuance. I would say that an empath is someone who understands the language of emotions and utilizes it as a tool. However, that's my own definition because there aren't a lot of people who identify themselves as empaths. And someone was saying to me, well, you're the proto-empath. You get to say what it is. And I said, well, great. That's great. I also make differentiations between the words empathetic and empathic. Whereas if you are empathetic and someone is crying, you might soften your approach to the person. You might get into a kind of a quiet, fluid place so that you are helping the person cry. That would be empathetic. To be empathic is to notice the crying and maybe be softened, but also see underneath the presenting emotions so that you can understand the crying may be extremely necessary at this time, or that the crying is covering something else. And so, yes, you want to be soft around the crying, but perhaps it would be more helpful to the person if you would maybe question whether crying is their go-to behavior or crying is really necessary at that point. It's sort of the difference between simply being with another person's presenting emotions. That would be empathetic. And to be empathic is really understanding what's going on at greater levels of abstraction. And what is interesting to me is that generally we have professionalized emotions and the understanding of emotions. So that if you or I have trouble with our emotions, sometimes we can go to a friend. But if it's deep trouble, we're going to have to go to a professional. And we're going to have to pay money and close the door. And we're going to have to talk in a sort of, sort of this crucible with either a psychotherapist or a psychologist or, a licensed clinical social worker or perhaps our doctor. That difficulties with emotions are taken out of the context of our everyday lives. That we don't get to say to someone, I'm feeling suicidal right now or whatever because, or I'm deeply, deeply depressed, or I am so full of rage, that sort of thing. Or I'm so happy I think I'm going to bust. We're taught not to understand emotions. And emotions are put off into a professionalized sphere, which is great when you're having a great deal of trouble. But it is hard if you do not have access to the professionals, if you don't have money, if you don't have medical insurance that covers behavioral health. That's a big issue. So a lot of us are running around all the time trying to figure out just what to do with our emotions. And when you talk about building a culture of empathy, and empathy for me is primarily an emotional skill. It's primarily a skill of understanding emotions, welcoming